Well, good afternoon. This is Mike Snelly from Oklahoma State University. I'm an extension specialist and professor in the Department of Horticultural and Landscape Architecture. I'll help co-host today's presentation from Dr. Todd Lasseigne, Bellingrath Gardens, Theodore, Alabama. Excited to have Todd back. If you've made any of the past plant material conferences, you'll remember Dr. Lasseigne lectured for me at least twice over the last 5 years, and if not there, you'll remember Todd when he worked at Tulsa Botanic Garden. So we've also encouraged you um, by email over the last several weeks to keep us in mind for next week. We have yet another free webinar, How Genetic Engineering Works, September the 21st, but you need to register for that, and you have the QR code and or the old-fashioned link, so to speak, on your email. Feel free to do that today if you haven't had a chance, and we hope to catch up with you then next week. And of course, I want to again thank Linda Shackelford and Charles Shackelford from TLC Oklahoma, formerly of TLC Oklahoma City, for faithfully underwriting the cost of these webinars. I'm excited that we have webinars. They're getting set up for the year 2022 next year. We've almost got them all assembled. You'll be hearing from us within about a month. And then December of this year, then we can all register for a number of additionally exciting topics in horticultural landscape architecture for next year. I really don't have any other announcements, so I would like just to remind you, if you haven't already read Dr. Lassaigne's impressive bio, that he had a couple things that stood out on me, in my mind, is just his dedication. He's visited over 450 botanic gardens during his career. He's worked in a number of settings, but he's just now finishing year one, though, of Bellingrath Gardens, again at Theodore, Alabama. And so he's going to talk to us today on his years in Oklahoma and then making that transition back down to basically where he grew up. He grew up in that part of the world. So he's home, so to speak, in Bellingrath Gardens. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over in a pre-recorded fashion to Dr. Todd Lasseigne. So Todd, welcome back to Oklahoma State University.
Okay, hello everybody, and I want to thank Dr. Mike Snelly for inviting me to give this presentation to you today. I also want to thank the able assistance of Peter Harwell and Donna Dollins, who helped put this together, this type of technological communications we now do. Sorry, I can't do this live, everybody. I had a major commitment here in Mobile, Alabama, come up after Mike had already asked me for a date. So here we are using technology to record this presentation, but I do want to say that I've offered to Mike that if there's any questions, I'm happy to record answers for them after the fact. So good to be talking to friends and colleagues and people I haven't even met over in Oklahoma. I hope you are all well. I hope the year has been kind to you. We've been wet here in Alabama, and it seems like it's continuing now with the remnants of tropical storm, or briefly a Hurricane Nicholas. So today, the topic I want to bring to you is one that Mike and I agreed on. And so I'm calling it From Zones 7A to 9B, Horticultural Pursuits from Oklahoma to Alabama. So I want to talk a bit about the 9.5 years that I lived in Tulsa, working to launch and create Tulsa Botanic Garden with a very talented staff who really, I think, saw us achieve some pretty cool things in that period of time. But I also want to relate to how I've transitioned now to the Gulf Coastal South. But before I do that, I realized that I have given you all the wrong title, because ever since I left Oklahoma, the weather's gotten even more freaky than when I lived there. So I've modified the title now to say From Zones 4B instead of 7A to 9B, Horticultural Pursuits from the Arctic to Alabama, because I realized that you all went down to the really cold temperature of -22. That's what I think I heard from Tulsa Botanic Garden. And if so, I'm kind of glad I wasn't there, y'all, but whew, that's cold. I hope not too many of the plants we planted there are dead, because we did not design that garden for that type of extreme weather. But anyway, I'm currently just into my second year here at Bellingrath Gardens and Home, where I am the executive director. We are a lovely estate garden, a pleasure garden in many ways, with the historic manor home that was formerly the home of Walter and Bessie Bellingrath, who I'll talk about a little bit later. And we're located just south of Mobile, Alabama, not far from Mobile Bay, on the, I guess you'd say, the shoreline of the Fowl River, Fowl, and it's just a lovely setting. So as we say down here, come on down and we'll give y'all a good time. So, but let's get into the talk. So first of all, I want to make sure everyone's paying attention. You know, make sure you're kind of ready. We're going to be talking about plants, and I need you to be looking straight ahead and make sure that you have your notes ready and that you're thinking about the topic, because there's a lot of cool and fun stuff that, you know, we want to do. So first of all, I have to show a few glimpses of place of my former employment, Tulsa Botanic Garden, where I served as president and CEO. These are historical images, of course, in the sense that I haven't worked there for a year now, but looking to the skyline of Tulsa in the distance, from the Tandy floral terraces and through the lake we have at Tulsa Botanic, you can see some lovely views of some of the gardens we created. Spring splendors here with the tulips in full display in one of the years. And here it is, a different year. You can see the lovely patterns that we have, and just a close-up of a crown imperial bulb backed by some lovely tulips. So if you haven't been to Tulsa Botanic Garden, go there and then come on down to Alabama and see me over here. We'll give you a good old time. I think what is fun about the things that we did in Tulsa is that we really tried a lot of different kinds of plants. And yes, in Oklahoma's rough and tumble climate, you're going to try and you're going to fail with a number of things, because it is a difficult climate in many ways, with cold winters, or in this year's case, super cold winters, baking hot summers, and then the vagaries of, you know, bitterly dry all the way to some kind of wet and lush years that we had in some of the years I was there. So I'm sure these vitex trees were frozen back in this past winter, and who knows if all the canna lilies made it, but what a joy to see all this texture. And I want you to know that this is something you can do. Over in the Children's Discovery Garden, you can see more of a prairie-like planting with these meadow flowers, if you will, of liatris and phlox, decorated with a few other things like Phlox paniculata, the panicled, not Phlox paniculata, excuse me, Hydrangea paniculata, the panicled hydrangeas. And one thing I do want to say in regard to when record weather hits, whether it's record floods or record heat or record drought or record cold, is I think our first instinct a lot of times is to pull back and say, oh, well, that was a mistake. I better not do that again. And, you know, so if you had plants that you lost to the cold, you may be thinking I shouldn't plant them again because they're dead. And my philosophy actually is, no, plant it again, plant it right away, because what's the chance of that record temperature happening again 2 years in a row? I think it's pretty low. So if something died in the winter, go buy another one and plant it in. And you know what? If you get 10 more years of joy out of it, and it's something you otherwise wouldn't have grown because you were too scared to grow it, well, you know, calculate your risk with how much you paid for the plant versus how much it gave you back over those 10 years. And hopefully we won't have another record. So it'll actually keep growing for you. So it's really important in our field of horticulture to remember who our end users are. And they're not just people like us, those of us who are already, you know, in the club, so to speak, but it's the average people who maybe are experiencing something for the first time, like these parents with their children watching them play around in the round pond here in the children's garden, you know, or in this cases, we had some students who came and were working in our nursery, potting up some ornamental grasses one day. And these kids had never worked in a nursery setting. and at the bottom, some volunteers who helped us plant more plants than we ever thought could be planted in a short period of time over in Tulsa. So, we need to spread the gospel that horticulture is a great field, that people can get out and enjoy the natural environment. They can do things like civic beautification or whatever it may be, and they can learn something at the same time and maybe feel better at the end of the day of all the things that they've accomplished. We can celebrate this in many ways. We can celebrate it directly through gardens and be pure, if you will, and say, no, we're just going to do gardens. Or we can do fun things like put out a pumpkin maze. And I gather that Tulsa's just received about, Tulsa Botanic Gardens received about 25,000 pounds, what I think I just read recently of pumpkins. So glad I'm not there to help them unload those. So good luck, farmer staff. And celebrating the 4 seasons. So this is something I'm not likely to see in Southern Alabama, but beautiful snowfall here, which we had one, I think that was in December, one year over at the Botanic Garden. And celebrating the holiday season through light displays. So I know Tulsa's done very well with this. This was the first year we had a major light display, and this was what it looked like the second year. And this brought out a lot of people who might otherwise have not gone to see the gardens. And so you may say that, oh, well, this is really not their mission. Why are they doing all this, spending all that time and money? But I say it is the mission in some ways, because you get people out to see what you're able to showcase who otherwise might never even given you the time of day or thought to drive 20 miles across town to go experience you. And we do very much the same thing here in Bellingrath, which I'll talk about later. So I had to show a little mountain boomer. So the Oklahoma State reptile, they are such a wonderful thing. I do miss those things. They'd hang around and let you get a little closer than you ever thought you could. And also want to talk about a few interesting things that I think are pertinent for Oklahoma in terms of, exploring your own biodiversity. So we had Andy Fusco, who's a student at Oklahoma State while I was there, and also was working kind of in an intern capacity at Tulsa Botanic Garden, and got interested in seeing if we could collect propagules of the native phlox in Oklahoma. There's several native ones, but this is the one that's actually named after the state, Phlox oklahomensis. And I was so excited when we actually got a small division that was collected from the wild that we could bring in and see if we could grow it in Tulsa. So there's a lot of cool biodiversity out there, y'all, even one named after your own state. Looking at plants in different ways is something I've always enjoyed. I kind of like taking a twist on something and seeing what we can do about it. So these bearded irises that you all see blooming here, this is a springtime shot. You can also see there's some Amsonia, or blue stars in bloom. But these bearded irises that we chose to plant are all reblooming, or what we sometimes call remontant bearded irises. And we selected those on purpose because we wanted to have irises that could bloom in the fall months. And so we selected a number of cultivars when we designed the garden. So here's one that is really reliable. It's called Champagne Elegance. And this is, just an image of showing what it would look like. Again, I think this is a spring picture, but it will do very much the same, maybe not quite as many blooms in the fall months. And sometimes it'll even bloom through the summer. And the reblooming irises come in a wide array of colors. Once they first realized that there were some of them out there that tended to rebloom, the breeders began to breed with those to create a lot of other new cultivars. So you can just see that there's a richness out there. You can have yellow or even the little orange one popping up on the right-hand side. You can actually enjoy all of those for fall effect. I also became interested in my 9 years of starting to look at some interesting plants that weren't in cultivation, but which were native in Oklahoma. And so one day driving up in some of the back roads in Osage County, came across this little wildflower, which kind of stopped me in my tracks. I had to turn around the truck and find a place to park it safely. And sure enough, it was, I thought it was a Cleome at first, and then it turned out to be a related genus called Polynesia. Never really keyed it out to species, but this was just growing a few miles away from Tulsa Botanic Garden up the road. And it's not in cultivation. You would not be able to buy this. So this is a rich heritage that I think we should both protect, but also collect responsibly collect seeds or propagules of so that we can grow them in our gardens too. And there's the planting along the road. I think it was mowed or sprayed a few weeks after I saw it, unfortunately. This is something I saw in southern Oklahoma. So it's one of the so-called sea hollies or eringos. Not a very good common name, but it's an annual, this species, Eryngium leavenworthii, which we saw along the railroad track in southern Oklahoma in Choctaw County. And oh boy, what a beautiful plant. I want to grow that here in Alabama. It's so beautiful with that silver foliage. And then when it blooms, it turns this vivid purple to blue purple color. You have some real rich areas of the Ouachita Mountains are really cool. I had the chance to explore them on a few occasions. And one of the groups of plants we were interested in looking into were the oaks. And there's a lot of very interesting oaks down there. One thing we found was this unusual white oak. So white oak is Quercus alba. And we found a bunch of trees, not just one, that had this almost skeleton-like leaf shape. And here you can see it. I'm sorry, it's out of focus, but you can see it in viewed from either my hand or the guy who was traveling with me. But this is really unusual to have this deeply dissected white oak. And someone needs to go back up on top of these mountains and collect some acorns of this because they weren't ripe at the time when we were there. We saw a lot of other oaks that didn't really fit anywhere. You're like, well, is this a red oak or is this a Schumered oak? And the truth to tell, I think it's a hybrid of those two. And then this one, I'd say, well, is it a black oak or is it a Schumered oak? And I'm like, well, it's probably a hybrid of those two. And then I came across this one, and I'm like, well, is that a Schumered oak or is that a southern red oak? And I think it's probably a hybrid of those two. So some very interesting things going on in those mountains, which are very poorly botanized. And I think there's untapped potential for some really cool plants and at least some southern genetics of stalwart tree species that are tough and can handle a lot of adverse conditions to be introduced into cultivation. This is an American beautyberry that a buddy of mine, Matt Welch, found a number of years ago down in Texas. And here it is growing at the Botanic Garden. It's selected for its pink fruits. And then so while I was up in the mountains in southeastern Oklahoma, we were on Sugarloaf Mountain on the Oklahoma side of the border. We found another pink one. And so we named it Sugarloaf Hot Pink. What this photo doesn't show is that it's actually more vividly pink than shown. It looks a little bleached out in this photo, but it was definitely a darker shade of pink than the normal one. And you can see the normal one is, darker shade of pink than Welch's pink. But you can see the normal color, the purple fruits is in the branch laid over. And it was just this one plant out of a whole population that had pink colored fruits because of some, genetic mutation that native plants do. A lot of interesting other things along the roadside. I guess on the beeline heading down towards Okmulgee, driving that one time, I found this very interesting little plant that I had to ask the state botanist to help me ID. It's a relative of beans, and it came out of Soralidium tenuiflorum. Sometimes they call them Pediomelum, Pediomelum, but a very interesting group of legumes that we probably should be growing. Sorry that the photos are a little fuzzy. I think my lens fogged up that day, but hot, humid summers in Oklahoma. But there you can see, look at the richness of that color against that green antelope horn milkweed, so which is a very familiar plant for any people who live in Tulsa. Not in Oklahoma, but just south in Texas. I've always been intrigued by yuccas. I just like their form and their architecture, and so I was driving around Athens, Texas, and on this sandy and rocky escarpment on the side of I think it's the loop around Athens, Texas. I saw these yuccas with fruiting capsules on top, so I had to stop and look at them, and it was pretty apparent to me once I got there that they were Yucca Louisianensis, which is a beautiful species that is not in cultivation. The flower spikes can reach 8 to 10 feet tall, and then you see these little filaments along the edge of the leaves. But this is a plant that should be in cultivation more. It is native in western Louisiana and eastern Texas, but it's easily hardy in throughout Oklahoma. Maybe the Panhandle, I wouldn't be as sure. but you just grow soapweed yucca up there anyway. So Yucca Louisianensis. Then one day going to one of the fine establishments that I like to visit every now and then in Tulsa, which was none other than Taco Bueno. I was in the drive-through and then saw these magnificent 2 specimens of Yucca rostrata in full bloom, and you can just, you know, I probably lost my appetite. I was so excited at seeing these yuccas. So this is a Mexican species that has been much more cold hardy than we ever would have thought. And these are about 5-6 foot tall specimens with a bloom spike on top. So that's something that you really want in your garden. If you plant them in too limey of a soil or a soil with too high of a pH, they'll kind of, the leaves will turn yellow a bit on you. So you want to avoid super high pH conditions. Growing in the floral terraces, we did a lot of interesting combinations where we play with texture as well as color. And color, remember, can come from your leaves as much as it can come from your flowers. So here's an area where we use one of the agaves with one of the wallflowers, one that we found out of a West Coast mail order nursery named John Codrington. And I think the agave may have bit the dust in this winter's blitzkrieg, but plant it again, get it again, and plant it again because it survived the other 5 winters before that, you know. So next time it goes to -22, put a little heater around it, but hopefully that'll never happen again. And you know, you can also play with texture. There is one palm native to Oklahoma. It's found only in McCurtain County, and it's just what I learned as the swamp palmetto. Some people just call it palmetto. So it depends on what part of the country you live in. Down here, we have several native palms. So this would be only one of several in lower Alabama. But McCurtain County, the plants grown from this population are much more cold hardy than seedlings grown from same species, say, collected down here in Alabama. So this is the one you'd want to grow. And in Tulsa, we had this at the Bot Garden. Although it may have been damaged by the freeze, I'd be surprised if it died because there were some planted in the Children's Discovery Garden. There's just a few plants that I think berry gardeners should grow if they're in a climate where they can grow them. And this would be one. This is the European Snowball Viburnum, sometimes called the Gelder Rose. Viburnum, Opulus, cultivar roseum, if I'm remembering right. And this is just a really great plant with these beautiful chartreusey yellow blooms. This will get about 8 feet tall or so. If you want something with even bigger flowers, you grow its Chinese cousin, Chinese Snowball Viburnum, and those flower heads are about 8 inches across, so or larger. And that one is a much more heat tolerant species, so that one I can grow down here in Alabama. But it would not. I would not be able to grow the European one because our winters are not cold enough. It needs more chilling. And then I played around with a group of plants. There's a lot of shrubs. You should just try different shrubs. You know, shrubs are generally cheap and pretty easy to grow. So Dutsia is a group of plants you don't see a lot, kind of considered an old-fashioned plant, but this is one called Dutsia Rubens. Rubens usually means to blush, like if it has a pinkish tones in the flowers. I never could figure out why this one was called that because it has the most pearly white blooms of any Dutsia I've ever grown. And this is just a beautiful plant. There's another plant called Beauty Bush or Colquitzia. This is a gold foliaged version called Dreamcatcher that's been around for 15 to 20 years now. And just a beautiful plant, bone hardy. This probably could survive a zone 4 climate. But anyhow, pink flowers with yellow leaves. So if you want gaudiness, here it is. It's all in one plant, all for you. And then speaking of gaudy, old-fashioned Weigelas, those are great, or Weigelia, however you want to say it. There's 15 pronunciations. And there's a lot of different ones here. Available, excuse me. And this is just one of the pink flowered ones that we grew in Tulsa. And some people say, well, they only bloom once. And I say, well, yeah, so do your azaleas. That didn't stop you from planting those. So just go and enjoy it instead of worrying about it blooming 365 days of the year. It's a cold hardy shrub. It's tough. It's going to bloom in the spring, last for a week or two. You're going to get some enjoyment, then it's going to go to sleep for the rest of the year, let something else take over. Another plant we have that we grew for foliage, and I didn't really know if this would do, but this is a plant from far northern Europe and China called Sorberia. This cultivar, Sim, it was selected for its gold foliage, and the new growth has some pinkish tones in it. Now it's a suckering plant, so you got to, it's gonna crawl or maybe run depending on the looseness of your soil. So you have to rogue it out where you don't want it, but it commingles into others, and then you just kind of take it back when you need to. But I love this plant. It turned out to be amazingly good in terms of holding its color in Oklahoma. I really thought when we planted it, it's on the back side of a wall where the kids play on the other side. I thought it was going to turn into Kentucky Fried Chicken the first summer and be brown, which is why I planted it there, and it didn't. And look at it, it looks great. Tree peonies. I was shocked. I learned from one of our first horticulturalists, Kenny Smith, that we should try tree peonies because he was growing them really successfully in Perkins. And yes, they are slow. They're not really trees, they're really shrubs. And you're not going to see a big one unless you wait about 20 years. But, when they bloom in the spring, and yes, the flowers don't last forever, but the flowers are about the size of your head. So that's okay. If the flower is the size of your head, it's okay if it only lasts for a few days. And this one's called Cherry Festival. Just fabulous, fabulous plants. A few things that just kind of saw here and there that we hadn't yet tried in Tulsa. This is a dwarf sweet bay magnolia called Sweet Thing. I think they should have named it Sweet Fang with an A, right? Because that just sounds better. So it sounds more southern. So it's kind of a shrubby version of a normal tree proportioned species. Sorry, I'm getting all these dings, y'all. The golden wax myrtle that we tried, that probably burnt to a crisp this winter, but hopefully it survived and is coming back. Some of the new Rose of Sharon cultivars that are coming out of proven winners. This is one called Purple Pillar, which is strongly upright. I don't know how tall that thing's going to get, but I'm thinking it's going to be a upright vertical hedge one day because it seems to be a very strong grower. And then some new hybrid beauty berries coming out of a breeding program in North Carolina at North Carolina State University. There were two that were released at first. There was Pearl Glam, which is this one, which I really like. Has kind of purplish foliage throughout the year and this nice presentation of purple berries. And then the second one they released was Purple Pearls, and it was a dog. In fact, these plants died back to the ground in a not so cold winter, and they really didn't come back, and I didn't shed any tears because it was a big rangy mass of foliage. It kind of flopped all over the place. The berries didn't really show a lot. So I didn't care if that we didn't have Purple Pearls, but I think Pearl Glam is a winner. You got to look in the back of this photo to see where it's in focus, but there's some group of plants called the ground cherries. And this is one of them. There's kind of two. I think we're screwed up as to what the proper name for this plant is. I learned it as Prunus jacomontii, which is a Himalayan native. And then there's also one called Prunus japonica. I think they're the same plant, and I don't know which is the correct name yet. But anyway, it blooms pretty early. It's a shrubby cherry. It's cherry plum. I said ground cherry earlier. I'm sorry, I meant cherry plum. And anyway, it's just a flowering machine, and it blooms before a lot of other things done. You get your flash of color, and then it's finished, and then has just nice foliage and a little bit of fall color. Some of the shrubby clematis. So you might say, well, I've never heard of a clematis that is shrubby. Well, this is one, and it comes from Upper Mongolia in Asia. And this one was actually selected by a late plantsman out of Nebraska, Harlan Hammernick, who had done some amazing plant exploration work in northern China and neighboring Mongolia. And he named this Mongolian Gold, and it grew just fine in kind of what I would call maybe eastern Nebraska. And then Steve Biebrich down west of, in Clinton, Oklahoma, was also growing and said it grew great. So we tried it in Tulsa, and it was a great plant. Just kind of ignore it, plant it and ignore it, and it does fine. It'll form a bush about 3 foot tall and wide. Some of the newer Sambucus are elderberries. This one called Lemony Lace, which 1 year observation was looked pretty good. So I wonder what it looks like now that I've left. So I think you got to observe plants for more than 1 year to make a final judgment. but I will say it was a pretty plant in the first year of performance. There's a lot of native St. John's works. I'm not saying this is the only one. I'm not saying this is the greatest one. It's just one I had a good picture of. This one's called Brody. This is a more southern one, actually, but did fine in Tulsa for the 5 years, I think, that we had it in the ground. Bulletproof plant, super heat tolerant, blooms these beautiful puffball yellow flowers. So get around and try some different things, y'all. In the perennial world, there's a lot of interesting plants in the aster family that we don't think about. One is the ground cover Senecios. Some of them are now called Pacaras or groundsel, Groundsel. So this is the running one. It will create a ground cover, and that's fine. If you want something to grow around it, maybe you got to make sure to edit it out so it doesn't take over. But if you just want a nice ground cover, it will be deciduous in the winter. This is a good one, and it has beautiful blooms on top of that in the spring. There's a different species that's a clumping one, and this one actually was named for its dark new growth and floral stalks, so it's called Dark Shadows, but it's Pacara aurea. Likewise, a selection of one of our native blue stars that was named for its dark stems, named Stormcloud. This is, I think, was released through Proven Winners. And that's just an exceptional plant. I mean, that dark foliage and dark stems really set off those powder blue flowers. Some of the poppy mallows are really amazing. And Marilyn Stewart at Wild Things Nursery introduced me to this plant. This is actually a pretty rare plant, y'all, in Oklahoma. I think it's of conservation concern. This is Callirrhoe bushii. And I knew other species before. I hadn't heard of this one until I moved there. And I think it's the best of all the others I've ever grown. This one is more floriferous. It spreads around. It doesn't seem finicky. It persists. It doesn't just live for 1 or 2 years and kind of disappear. So this is one y'all should grow, Callirrhoe bushii. And then I love Indian pink, as this plant is known, or Spigelia marilandica. Got red flowers and yellow on the inside. It's kind of hard to beat. It can grow in more sun than a lot of the books will tell you. I don't know if I'd put it in full sun in Oklahoma, but it's pretty tough. One of the big surprises for us is we decided to try some eupatoriums, or I'm sorry, they're now eutrochium, excuse me. Eutrochiums or Jopai weeds is the common name, although it's probably not a common, we probably should come up with a better common name. It's a bit derogatory. But this one is a standard cultivar that you see in the northeastern US called Gateway. And I didn't think it would do well, but I wanted to try it anyway. So it was in the children's garden. And to my amazement, it performed just as good as if it was growing in England. And then I learned after the fact from Marilyn Stewart that the species would grow too, because she was growing eutrochium, I'm still saying eupatorium, Eutrochium fistulosum, which is a different species. This one was maculatum. There's 3 or 4 species that look similar. And so Jopai weeds for Oklahoma, who would have thought? But Maryland's ones are actually grown from seed collected in central Oklahoma. But Gateway is a cultivar, so not from Oklahoma source, that's for sure, and did just fine. So a lot of really cool things you can learn. Some new breeding work coming out of Texas, represented by J. Berry Nursery, are these kind of blue or smoky toned flowered perennial hibiscus. And so this is just one. We were trying them down in Tulsa. I think they'll do fine. I think they're fairly cold hardy. Hopefully they came through the Blitzkrieg. But this one is cordon bleu. And I really like that combination of that almost lavender colored flowers. I think they look a little more bluer in real life. Those tones are sometimes hard to capture with cell phones, and that kind of maroon to red colored center. Then some of the amazing work being done in Baptisia breeding. This is just, I could talk all day about Baptisias, but this is one called Pink Lemonade, where the flowers are yellow and then aged to pink. And I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, there'd be bicolored flowering Baptisias, I would have said, you're crazy. And now there's several. There's one called Lunar Eclipse, which just goes from white to pale blue, I think. If you want to talk about pollinators and plants that are good for pollinators, you probably can't do any better than Rattlesnake Master or Eryngium yuccifolium. I showed a different Eryngium earlier along the railroad tracks that we found in Leavenworthii, but yuccifolium is very common throughout most of Oklahoma. This one's a perennial. The other one was an annual. And actually, it's kind of funny. I got a photo of it with nothing on it, no insects on it. It's usually crawling with all kinds of insects, and really, really cool plants. Plant that I got introduced to from our designer when he was designing the gardens for us. I had seen this in Atlanta Botanical Garden, was an aster relative called Boltonia decurrens. I've known other Boltonias, but I didn't know this species. And before it blooms, it looks like this. It's just green fuzz, this kind of about 2 foot tall to 3 foot tall, green, hazy foliage. And when it blooms, and I couldn't find a good photo I had of it in bloom, it just looks like a bunch of little white daisies on top. And it just creates this beautiful haze and lasts a long, long time. It's just a really, really awesome plant. Don't be afraid to mix your tropicals in. So this is a well-known aster, native aster, or a selection of the aromatic aster called Radon's Favorite. And we decided one year to plant some tropical passion vine nearby. This is Passiflora coccinea, I think, the red-flowered one. And it has no hardiness whatsoever. It died after the first freeze. But I love how it just kind of grew around the aster and kind of made itself a new partner there. And we do this here in Bellingrath, and I don't want you to be scared of this, but be bold with your plantings. We got more comments one year when we decided to trim the coleus like they were little boxwood hedges. And people were commenting, "Oh my God, how did you make the coleus grow like that?" And it's like, well, we trimmed them. We got out the pruning shears and the hedge trimmers, or however we did it. You'll have to ask Dustin Stoll. He's curator of the terraces. He can tell you, but yeah, you can do whatever you want. You can prune tropical plants just like you can prune temperate zone plants. So don't be scared. And keep supporting Steve and Ruth over at Bustani Plant Farm, because this is one of their introductions from, I think from Kenya, Ipomea yeageri, which is a tropical or non-cold hardy, at least, perennial morning glory, but it's a shrub and it kind of wants to grow flat. And it's a really awesome plant. I love that foliage, and I love those kind of pinky lavendery flowers. And it doesn't seed around like tie vine will do, or any of the kind of wild, morning glories. And have fun with your plants. So this is Cascade Falls, Weeping Bald Cypress over in Stephen F. Austin Gardens down in Nacogdoches, Texas. So you might say, I love weeping plants, or you might say, I love upright or fastigiate plants or columnar plants. Yes, some of you may have seen this photo before. This is kind of a windy day. Imagine that over in Tulsa. And this plant's growing up like a beanpole. Lindsay Skyward, Greenleaf Nursery, was the first to put it into production. It's an outstanding plant. Don't know how tall it's going to get. So I think it'll keep growing for the sky, but it's beautiful. There's an aspen that was found in the panhandle of Nebraska in some type of ancient sand dune ecosystem, but way outside of the normal range of the Rocky Mountains. And so they named it Prairie Gold, and we planted them in the Children's Discovery Garden. And they were there for about 4 years and didn't seem to be showing any problems. Yes, they sucker. You got to cut the suckers out. But, an aspen that'll live for more than 3 days outside of the mountains is a good aspen, in my opinion. And you get that beautiful white bark. A lot of people know this plant now, the Eastern Red Cedar. There's an upright form called Taylor. Funny thing about this plant is Taylor is a female cultivar, but it doesn't seed around a lot, or I haven't actually seen it seed at all. Whereas we know normal Eastern Red Cedar is kind of a scourge, and because it's so weedy throughout Oklahoma. And so you can see it, a number of them in the Children's Discovery Garden. Keep experimenting, people. This is a redbud, a Chinese redbud that came out of North Carolina State University, selected for early bloom, and it was named for a late coach, a great women's basketball coach, Kay Yao, who died of breast cancer. And so they were giving funds initially, and I guess they still are, to support breast cancer research because of this plant. Kay's early hope. Mexican dogwood. This is one I thought we'd kill in the first winter in Tulsa. And it was alive when I left, so it survived probably about 5 or 6 winters. The bracts on Mexican flower dogwoods, or at least some of them, are fused at the tips, make this little pagoda-like appearance. This was a gold foliaged red maple, named by an old friend of mine, Richard Schock, So he named it Shocking Gold. And yes, his name does have a C, so it's SCH. And then some variegated red maples, one called Candy Ice with this tricolor growth, another one called Vanity, also with a tricolor growth. They're slightly different, not too much, but kind of interesting. A box elder selected for its yellow twigs in the winter, aptly named Winter Lightning, and a variegated catalpa called Pulvirulenta that I like. So, but I'm a weirdo. I like almost every variegated plant. We did plant these upright hackberries, excuse me, couldn't get that out, in the floral terraces, but they're not 100% upright. They kind of fly around in the breeze a little bit, but this was actually found in far western Kansas, growing in a hedgerow by a faculty member at Kansas State University somewhere around 25 years ago, and probably closer to 20. And so it was later named Prairie Sentinel. Quercus bucklei is a nice short-statured oak down from Texas that a lot of really good plantsmen in the know in Oklahoma always tout its virtues, and I agree with them. It's kind of like a compact version of a Shumard oak or Shumard. Can't remember how y'all say it there. They say it differently down here, and I'm trying to remember how to pronounce it. I think there's a lot of cool things in wisteria. We don't need to grow the Japanese or the Chinese ones, as lovely as they can be. We had a couple in Tulsa at the Bot Garden that were kept in an area where they could be contained. But if you're worried about them escaping into the wild, then plant the American or the Kentucky one. Some people say they're the same thing, but the one on the left is Amethyst Falls, which is a cultivar of American Wisteria frutescens. There's different ones of Kentucky. And there's even a white flowered version of both. The white version of Kentucky Wisteria is called Clara Mac. The white version of American is called Nivea, Nivea. I think there's a shampoo called Nivea or something like that. So that should help you remember it. And then I love our native coral honeysuckle, and it's normally red, but there are some yellow forms out there, including one called John Clayton, and then a fabulous little mail order nursery in Western Louisiana called Almost Eden found this peach colored one, which they named Tangerine Princess. So we planted this in the children's garden, and it's really vigorous, just like the normal native red one, and as is the yellow. So firecracker vine probably did not survive -22 Fahrenheit, but buy it again and just plant it again. It has a big bulbous-like, or I guess a tuber almost like structure underground. Blooms in the dead heat of summer. The hotter, the better. And the hummingbirds go nuts. Talk a little bit about irises, because I love irises. So this Japanese roof iris, we planted these in full sun on purpose. And yeah, they kind of bleach in the summer, but plants were doing remarkably okay considering it wasn't optimal conditions. I think there's so much for iris that you can do in Oklahoma. I talked about beardeds earlier. Louisiana irises grow great where you have a little more moisture. So this is Jerry. This is Prix d'Elegance. These were given to us in Tulsa, and they're just fabulous. There's Japanese iris you could grow, which is Iris insata, Ensata. Many of them. I'm not saying this Gray Woods River Song is the best, just one. There's the Siberian types. The wild type is just a species, Iris sanguinea. There's a lot of cultivars now. So just to show you, they're not just purple or blue. They're almost reddish violet kind of color. I love this salamander crossing with those patterns, or ruffles and flourishes with those ruffly petals. Then there's some irises that are hybrids between different species. This is hybrids between the yellow flag iris of the Mediterranean and the Japanese ones I showed you earlier. So this one with this beautiful eye spots in the center, Chance Beauty. Look at this one, Shirioku. You gotta like that. They're called Sudatas. They're really cool. And then there's a type of a group of irises called Spurias, because a parent species, Iris spuria, or irises in the Spuria group. There's a lot of different kinds of iris species. And this one, Shelford Giant, was growing in the children's garden. And, you get an iris that hits 3 to 4 feet tall, comes back every year, and butter and eggs type of look. That's pretty darn good, y'all. Lilies, Oklahoma does great with lilies. I'd say Black Beauty almost does too great because it's, man, when it got going, I mean, talk about, clobbering the garden. I mean, it was like, wow, I never thought a lily could just do something like this, but this is amazing. And then we also grew some species ones like the royal lily, Lilium regale, and just flourishes. They don't last forever, but a lot of them have fragrance like this one. They're wonderful, and just enjoy them while you have them, but they're good long-term perennials. Naked ladies, or Lycoris in this case, Squamidra, the pink naked ladies, do fabulous. You see them all over Tulsa. Drumstick alliums can maybe they won't be there for 10 years, but you can easily get 3 years out of them unless you drown them. If you drown them, they'll rot, but you can get 3 years out of them, and then maybe you have to replant. And the bulbs are cheap, so they're semi-perennial. Daylilies, you could talk all year long. So there's just a few. And then terraces, mighty chestnut, Sunday gloves. Who doesn't want Sunday gloves? I like some of the taller ones. This is August Flame, and look at this baby. This is about 4.5 feet tall, and it's blooming in August. So it's kind of late, and it's very tall. So it's really neat. Again, some texture shots, in front of the Grange, the event center that we built in Tulsa, and look at it in the winter time. So this is not exactly the same bed. I'm going to jump across a path to go, but the plants in the next photo are also in this bed. You just don't see them. That's pretty cool that you can get that kind of effect, right? Very good, a well-designed perennial border will give you interest throughout the year. And look at the texture here, some cactus, some irises, a few tropical palms thrown in the containers, a little wildflower related to evening primrose at the bottom. And I want you to also celebrate your natural heritage. When I was driving the Indian Nations Turnpike with my wife one day, we came across this field of this liatris, acres and acres and acres. It was just, we had to stop. It was just unbelievable. The native coneflower in the Tulsa area is Echinacea pallida, and the pale coneflower is called, and kind of has a lot of grace that I think the modern hybrids have lost, although it doesn't have the color range of the hybrids. And so I really like this one. And then this last one from Tulsa is one of the Enotheras and or evening primroses. And this plant, this was one that we planted in the gardens, and it did fine. But then then we took a few up, put them in a pot, and brought them into the nursery. And it decided it did not want to grow in a pot. It wanted to creep out the bottom, drip holes of the pot, and grow in the grit, the gravel grit of the nursery. And so you just got to tell a plant like that, like, hey, man, I respect you. If that's what you want to do, you're going to do. So we're going to let you go. So let's jump down south a little bit. So I'm a big oak person. So I was visiting a nursery near New Iberia, Louisiana, pretty south, not far from the Gulf. And I saw this row of oaks and quickly realized they were Compton oaks. And I'm not saying you're going to grow this in Oklahoma. I mean, maybe in McCurtain County you would, but this is a hybrid of live oak, the classic big oaks down in the South, and a species that dwells in swamps called overcup oak, Quercus Lyrada. And Quercus Lyrada has lobes. Live oak does not have lobes. So what do you get when you cross a lobed oak with a oak whose leaves don't have lobes? Well, you kind of get an oak that has leaves that are kind of halfway lobed. And if one's evergreen and the other's deciduous, what do you get in the cross? You kind of get one that's kind of halfway evergreen or semi-evergreen. And it's just interesting. It goes to show you that these plants will, be promiscuous in the wild. They will hybridize. They will, one species will pollinate another. This is a naturally occurring hybrid. It was not just made in a laboratory somewhere, if you will. So it was really cool to see these plants. And here we are kind of looking around. This was a professional meeting I attended. And then we heard about a really rare oak at some gardens we'd gone to. And it's, as far as I could tell, was the only oak of its kind in the entire US. And it's a Chinese species that had been collected. And then when I saw the bark, I was like, you got to be kidding. This bark looks more like a buckeye bark or maybe some weird shag bark hickory or something, but it was an evergreen oak. And so it turned out to be Quercus gilva. So when you see something like that and you're like, this collection probably dates back 100 years, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of important. That's not going to grow in Oklahoma. I don't even think this would grow in McCurtain County, but this is all about genetics and, plant collecting. As long as it's not a weed, we don't want any more invasives, right? But if it's going to be a well-behaved plant and has some value, either ecosystem value as a pollinator, non-natives can be pollinators, right? It's not just natives, or it can just be a good street tree that's tough and adaptable. So this plant needs to be shared. We need to go collect some acorns from this thing down in, I think it's in Jungle Gardens on Avery Island, Louisiana, where Tabasco's from. We need to go collect this and share this so there's not only one plant that gets blown over by the next hurricane in the Gulf or something. And those undersides of the leaves are white. Look at that. That's definitely different. There's nothing like that in cultivation, especially with bark like this. So that's exciting. That was a red letter day to see that plant. Man. And here's just something else going on. This is actually happening at a breeding program, but there's a genus called Dicroa, which is kind of like an evergreen hydrangea that produces blueberries. Yeah, I know that sounds weird, but it does produce blueberries. And of course, there's hydrangeas. Well, now the molecular scientists say they're the same thing. But anyhow, if you don't believe the molecular scientists, you could say, well, if you cross a Dicroa times a hydrangea, what do you get? Well, you get a dihydrangea. So that's going on at the National Arboretum Research Station in McMinnville, Tennessee. And they're trying to see what they can produce. So this plant's kind of intermediate between a hydrangea and its blueberried cousin. So it's kind of neat. Well, let's come to Bellingrath. So I want to kind of close my talk out talking about where I'm at right now. So these are our founders. This is Mr. Walter Bellingrath, and this is his wife, Bessie Morse Bellingrath. Mr. Bellingrath was an entrepreneur. He came from a humble background, kind of in southern Alabama, worked on the railroads and a few other odd jobs and other stuff with his father, but came to live in Mobile and quickly realized his entrepreneurial spirit in that he was basically, on the one hand, the right man at the right time, but on the other, he had the right skill set and he had a lot of foresight. He ended up buying the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Mobile, and along with his brother, bought the one in Montgomery, Alabama in 1903. And the rest, as they say, is history. So he made his fortune through Coca-Cola. So you ate a Coke? Man, that tastes good. So thank you, Mr. Bell. Thank you, Miss Bessie. Miss Bessie is responsible for the gardens here at Bellingrath. And when she died unexpectedly in 1943, he lived until 1955, and he never got over it. She was the love of his life, and so he set aside a trust, and the mission of the trust is to basically to honor and perpetuate his wife's artistry and genius. So how many of you can say that about your wives? That your wife is an artist and a genius. I love that. It's just fabulous. It's a love story. So we are here to perpetuate her vision of the gardens and continue from there, along with the home that Mr. Bellingrath ended up bequeathing also upon his death. So here we're located. So we're actually located in the town Theodore. It's not really a town. It's just it's unincorporated, but you can see that in the north of the map. Mont Louis is just a place name here. And this is south of Mobile, and you can see Mobile Bay in the center of the photo. And there's kind of a satellite image of Bellingrath Gardens. And you may say, well, I don't see the gardens. And you would be correct, because we have so many trees, particularly our evergreen live oaks, that you really don't get to see much of the gardens from space. So there's a lot of shade here, and shade gardening is very different than what we were doing in Tulsa when I was there with full sun garden on open land. So this is what happened 2 weeks after I got there, y'all. That little gal named Sally at the bottom, and I'll show you where Bellingrath is located. Right there. So we're living in an active period now, certainly in the Gulf of Mexico region for hurricanes. We're having another bad year this year. My folks live in Thibodeau, and Ida came through and blasted up Thibodeau, but my mom and my sister-in-law, thankfully, they're okay, and their homes are okay. But you know, you don't want a hurricane coming to your garden. It just doesn't mix well. And so Sally formed was a Category 1 hurricane, maybe a Category 2 at landfall, but it was moving glacially at about 3 miles per hour. And boy, when that eye passed to the north of us, she had the biggest right hook because the north winds came down, and I guess the soils were so saturated, we were pretty wet to begin with a year ago in September. It's a year ago from today, the 15th is when I'm giving this talk, and it knocked more trees down than you can imagine. And Bellingrath was impacted. So this is kind of some of our iconic oaks. These are still standing. These are some sand live oaks, a different species than live oak. But this is what I came back to, you know, the day after the storm or the day of the storm. And then, you know, this is a beautiful American holly, about 40 feet tall, blown over. Here's another one blown over in our so-called gazebo garden. And then this was a big sand live oak that had tore a branch off the size of Montana. Then we realized the tree was hollow in the middle, so that didn't help. This tree has since self-destructed, almost like a Bradford pear, and I think it's because of the loss of this limb 12 months ago. It lost its other primary limb about 3 weeks ago. So we've had to cut it down, and that hurts when you lose a 100-year-old tree. And this is what our boardwalk looked like. It goes through a bamboo forest, which is pretty cool. So hurricanes are bad, y'all. Tornadoes are bad too. I'm not minimizing tornadoes, but hurricanes are bad. So what do we do down here at Bellingrath? Well, the gardens are very much representation of this climate. We're in zone 9B, which is very mild. Until last year, when we went to 22 degrees, when y'all went to negative 22, which was historic, we went to 22, which is not historically cold. We can get into the teens, but it's cold because we hadn't had a freeze for the prior 2 years, according to my staff. I wasn't here, but that's what they told me. They said we had 2 winters in a row with no freezes. So we were doing things like this where you could grow cordylines or the house plant, right? Hawaiian Thai plant and some different begonias. We were growing those outside. Normally, even here, that would not necessarily make a permanent plant. You have to go down to Miami for that to be the case in a true tropical climate. So anyhow, you have this lush experience, and you get a lot of greenery, and sometimes that can be a problem because you want more than just green to look at with all the broadleaf evergreens. So it can be a challenge to enliven spaces up sometimes because you have so much omnipresent green foliage. So we do a lot of container gardening. So here's some cane begonias with some little sedum Angelina. You got to love that plant. My dad used to call my sister Angelina. Her name's Angela, so I always like that. This is a view into our rose garden. We have a classic American style rose garden. And so this is a view leading through with some camellias, holly ferns, and acubas with some cabbage palms in the distance. Beautiful fountain. This is our long border on the Great Lawn. This is a 400-foot long by about 5 foot wide, 6 foot wide annual display border that we change out about 3 times a year, but we piddle with it in terms of lesser changes about 3 other times. So we're in this bed about 6 times a year, and it's a lot of work, but it's magnificent. So you can see it in its summer dress with all this foliage interest right here. And here's another change out border that we do of annuals, but this one's in shade. Now you actually have some similar plants as in the last photo because some of your shade plants will grow almost as well in sun. So we have some New Guinea impatiens and some copper plants and some of the Napier grass cultivars, and of course some sweet potato vine, because you got to have sweet potato vine. It's such a good filler. And then here's a beautiful view with New Guinea impatiens and some spiral ginger, which even that would be tender for us in an average year. We got to be careful with it, and some boxwood hedges. And here's kind of a plant that I think is a claim to fame for Bellingrath. We all take sun coleus for granted now because sun coleus have been around forever. Well, the truth of the matter was, no, they weren't. In the 1980s, you used to get coleus. You'd have to buy them from seed, and you'd grow these so-called shade coleus that were seed grown. They were always the weakest little plants in the world, and they were kind of pathetic, and they get powdery mildew. And then someone, I don't know who, maybe Bellingrath, to say, well, no, if you grow out some plants from seed and you select the more vigorous ones, they can be grown in the sun, but you have to select the best ones. So you cull out the duds, cull them out, and then you keep the ones that are good. And so this one arose here with this beautiful pink foliage, and it got named at Bellingrath Pink. But unfortunately, someone else got a hold of it before Bellingrath's name took hold. And so it became known as Alabama Sunset. And that's the name that's really stuck. We still call it Bellingrath Pink here because it originated here. But Alabama Sunset became the original sun coleus. And so all the vegetatively propagated coleus cultivars now, and we know vegetatively propagated tender perennials is the thing. You know, it's taking a bigger market share every year. Like New Guinea impatiens are all vegetatively propagated. Well, Alabama Sunset put coleus back on the map in a lot of ways. And now you can go from religious radish to fishnet stockings to cathedral windows to whatever the latest and greatest vegetatively propagated coleus is. There's about 1,000 or 1,000,000 of them. I don't know how many there are. So anyhow, I wanted to talk about that plant. And then there's a little pink shrimp plant in there too, Justicia cornea. So here's some of our bedding. This is Mona Lavender Plectranthus, which is a really good old plant growing in one of our fountains in containers. This is our grotto with some annuals around it in containers. Biggest problem we face here is we have such a long growing season. Literally, our growing season is March until our first freeze is normally December 5th, I guess, around here. I'm still learning. So we have a 9-month growing season. And so plants get root bound in a container, even though you're switching them out multiple times a year. And so these are historic containers, but I wish they were bigger because the roots fill that space pretty quickly. This is the courtyard fountain and garden in the home, near the home, The home has a courtyard. This is one of the beautiful rills that we have, and there's a little fountain with a mermaid. We call it the mermaid fountain, a little statuette at the far end, and one of our beautiful curved sand live oaks. This is just Mother Nature created these. We didn't train these. And beautiful views along the home. This is a view towards the Fowl River, F-O-W-L, not F-O-U-L. And there's about a 30-acre salt marsh that we own right across the river. So we own this view, and it's just magnificent. There's our boathouse, the latest iteration. We've probably had 3 or 4 in our history. They come and go with the hurricanes. Hopefully this one will last long. It still needs to be repaired from Sally from last year because we lost a lot of the cedar shakes. Here's our conservatory in the rose garden, and it was it's not huge, but it's a nice, beautiful little Lord and Burnham conservatory, and it was built in 1935, and it's been refurbished in the 1990s at least. I don't know if it was refurbished before then. I'm still learning. We need to do some more work on it now, but it was meant to be a collection of exotica. So kind of the classic Victorian model of conservatories that you collect some wild and unusual tropical plants to display for your guests. Overlooking the lake, our Mirror Lake, as we call it, is our lion statue. And there's a view of Mirror Lake. A few plants that are really cool that I found when I got here, the orange flowered osmanthus. We have huge ones. We have a 30-foot tall one, a veritable tree, orange flowered osmanthus. This is our rockery that goes down, really beautifully designed with a stone laid in place. A few interesting mahonias. This is a Himalayan species. I found this oak one day walking around. I was like, what is that little acorn? And this is a pretty rare oak. This is a relative of sawtooth oaks, which are very widely grown in Oklahoma, actually. This is its cousin from southern China, whereas sawtooth is more central and northern China. So this is Quercus Chenii, C-H-E-N-I-I, named after a famous Chinese botanist. And it's just basically smaller in all respects to sawtooth oak. So smaller acorns, smaller leaves, thinner leaves, not as prominently toothed, but a really beautiful plant, and frankly, better adapted here than sawtooth is. We do a beautiful presentation every year of Cascading Chrysanthemums, which you may know also as Korean chrysanthemums or Korean mums. And we grow these. We have to train them into these shapes. It takes us 10 months to grow these. And it's basically done by a team of ladies who have mastered this subject over the last several decades. And we put these out on display. They bloom for us in as early as late October, all the way through basically Thanksgiving. And so we have the largest outdoor chrysanthemum, cascading chrysanthemum display in the US. Longwood also does it, as does New York Botanical Garden, but because they get too cold by this time of the year, where these bloom later than your traditional mums, they have to grow them inside. So here you can see them shaped as some pillars, and you can see them hanging from the bridge in Mirror Lake. They're just lovely. And here's a close-up with a Salvia madrensis, the so-called Forsythia sage, and kind of commingling with one of our cascading mums. We're very famous for our Christmas festival, which we call Magic Christmas and Lights, and it is indeed magical. This is just one of many views. We had 96,000 visitors last year, record, and kept us shaking and moving, and good time of year. This is our azaleas. We create all of the displays, including the pieces we fabricate them here, and we professionally string them with our own staff. This is the new exhibit we revealed last year, which was Mardi Gras. You all know I'm from Louisiana, so sometimes pains me to admit that Mobile was indeed the first place to have Mardi Gras. But here it is. So we honored the tradition of Mardi Gras as originated here in the US in Mobile with the Mardi Gras exhibit. This is just one piece of quite a number. Really cool. Then kind of coming into spring, Taiwan Cherries, which is a species from Taiwan, is the one that really does great here. I mean, it's from that part of the world where has a similar climate to us, and they just really grow great. We don't have to worry about them not living long like other cherries would. Try a lot of bedding. So this is a crop of mimulus or monkey flowers. Did great for us in the transition season between winter and spring. And you can see it also with some purple mustard and some snapdragons. And we used parsley as a ground cover, which was great here. Came through the whole winter because we're mild enough. We do delphiniums as a late winter specialty crop for bedding. So these are grown and forced in the greenhouse. And then we produce fabulous delphiniums, but they are not perennial here. They do not exist in the summer. They are done by then. And they wouldn't survive our summers anyway. We grow our own Easter lilies. So here you can see with some nice Dusty Millers, probably some annual phlox, I guess, at the bottom, and also dianthus. You can see that same dianthus here with some forced tulips. We have to force the tulips here. Our winters aren't cold enough, so we have to buy in pre-chilled bulbs and then force them. We're known for our southern indica azalea hybrids. So we have scores and scores of these, and the whole place turns pink. It's unbelievable, y'all, in usually late March or mid-March, I should say. We're also well known for our Camellia collection, so just a handful. We actually have a great Camellia collection, but unfortunately, due to the hurricane of record for Mobile is Hurricane Frederick in 1979, and our Camellia collection was in a certain part of the property was destroyed. And the Camellia, a lot of the labels were lost then, and we have to rebuild that. This is Seafoam, which is a newer cultivar, but beautiful. We don't know what this one is. It's exquisite. And the flower, from flower to flower on the same plant, they don't look the same because these speckled ones are usually done because of a plant virus. That's what causes them to be variegated in their flowering. And then Pink Perfection, one of the best known of all the Japanese camellias. Can't beat this one for a formal double. And then Professor Sargent, which I learned on coming here. I was like, why are there so many Professor Sargents at Bellingrath? And the horticulture director, Chuck Owens, said, well, it used to be the rootstock of choice around here because it's such a vigorous plant. And so go figure, after Hurricane Frederick, or maybe some of the great freezes in the early 1980s, 83 was the worst year here. where we went to single digits. Some of those camellias froze back to the graft, and then the root stock came up. So thus, we have a lot of Professor Sargents that we need to probably figure out what to do with. We have a few dogwoods hanging on. Down here, it's not the dogwood anthracnose that's killing them. It's the dogwood powdery mildew, which also is an imported disease. And there's maybe 3 plants left in the gardens. So we've made the decision to start spraying those 3 trees, because otherwise they're going to die, and then we'll have no native Cornus florida left. So we are treating these 3 dogwoods on our property, but this is one of the 3 remaining ones, sadly. So you might say, well, what am I doing in an old garden versus a new garden? Bellingrath Garden was open to the public in 1932, and although it was under various stages of being planted for probably the prior 13 years. And so we have a lot of things that I have to deal with. And it's kind of a lot of ways like a new garden. There's a lot of infrastructure that in this case needs to be rebuilt or refurbished. But on the other hand, it's very different than a new garden that I have with things like this, like a lot of old trees. So this is a live oak. And when I look at this tree, it kind of scares me because I see there's heart rot in the middle, excuse me. And also you can see a trunk has been cleaved off. That could have been done that could be a damage from 1979. And here we are, 40 plus years later, and the tree is kind of recovered. But unfortunately, that trunk that broke off in that hurricane still remains in a pretty bad state. So how do you deal with that? Is this tree still structurally sound? Do you cut it down just because of that? I don't know. It's kind of a hard question to answer. I guess it depends on where it is, right? If it's hanging over your historic home, you probably should cut it down. But it's really hard to cut a big oak like that down, right? So we have to figure these things out. This is something that should have been taken care of. We discovered this after we got a bunch of creeping fig, which is kind of weedy here. Yeah, the little house plant, creeping fig, Ficus pumila. So we got it off and discovered that the trunk had this old guy wire. I guess this is an osmanthus, of all things, a sweet olive. It's huge. And it must have been guyed quite a number of years ago. And then unfortunately, they never took the guy wire out of the trunk. So my feeling is that when we take that out, that branch will be too weak, will have to be cut off. But when we cut off that branch, the rest of the tree then becomes unstable because all of the weight will be on the opposite side. So we probably have to cut the whole thing down. I don't want to cut a 30-foot tall sweet olive down, y'all. So this is a hard decision. You see things like this. We're just old. We've been underfunded for a number of years. So you got old ligustrums that have grown into the brickwork. So we got to get rid of that and probably fix damage to the masonry. Something that shouldn't have been done. Why did they put this railing in and screw the cross bracings into the trunks of their bald cypress trees? I can't answer that question, but I know we're not going to do it that way. We have to fix that. And actually, the whole path is a kind of a disaster. So, you do that. And this is not a criticism, just reality, right? So we've started some rejuvenation. We've been taking some overgrown plants out, like some huge Chinese holly, some dwarf Chinese holly, actually, in this case, that are no longer dwarf. Here's a case where we had a cycad at an intersection of 2 sidewalks, which probably was nice and cute and perfectly fit the size 30 years ago, but kind of outgrew the space. So we whacked it back and we cut off some of the trunks after that. This was an area we had some overgrown gardenias. I know that may be hard for you to believe in Oklahoma, but we had 10-foot tall gardenias and they were chlorotic. They had yellow leaves. Gardenias are notorious for needing a lot of iron. They get iron chlorosis very easily. So we just ripped them out because they were ugly. And this is right behind our cafe. So we put an herb garden in, which kind of makes sense. This is not a historic area. We had some overgrown hollies. So I took the opportunity to teach my staff how to do hat racking, which is a specialized process in holly, pruning practice in hollies, where you prune them back to lateral branches, but leave enough that literally you can hang your hats on it. And you would think, oh, you stub them that severely and they're going to die. But no, hollies can take an amazing amount of abuse in terms of pruning. So they're coming back just fine. I've learned here that chestnut blight, which you probably know is what killed all the chestnuts in North America. They only exist as stump sprouts now in the wild. Well, unfortunately, it also attacks live oaks. It doesn't seem to kill them, but it does this, where it gets in and there's disease inside this bark tissue, and it creates this deformed and ugly bark, where the inner bark tends to whatever, something happens and it sloughs off and it looks diseased. It's not so diseased you need to cut it down. It just doesn't look healthy. Well, in this case, this particular live oak, this is the backside. And so I came in, I was like, okay, we can't do this anymore, so no place is perfect, and we are not perfect. So we've had some things that you look back, you just get a fresh set of eyes and you say, nope, let's not put the electrical infrastructure for Christmas lights attached to the tree. So we're removing this and putting it on the ground on a pedestal, which is what it needs to be done as. But this is what happened for whatever reason. I'm not judging, and we're just going to fix it. So that's what you do when you come to a new place. You go look and see what needs to be fixed, then you get it done. We took the opportunity of the successful Magic Christmas season we had to continue renting our cherry picker or our man lift, whatever you want to call it, this is what didn't happen until the spring, to get all the remaining hanging branches out of the trees along our service roads, because Hurricane Sally had damaged so many trees. We had hanging branches all over the place, but we didn't have any equipment to get access to them, and certainly didn't want to pay for a professional company to come in, because it would have been tens of thousands of dollars of work. So we just continued to rent the man lift that we normally use to set up and then take down our Christmas exhibits, and we used it to do other work too. So that was money well spent, but it came because we had a successful Christmas season, and so we had some funds available. Here's another example of something that was done probably 40 years ago. So I decided to put parking lot lighting directly, literally affixed to some of the live oaks. So this is going to come out. So this probably sounded like a good idea 50 years ago, but it's not a good idea anymore, because we don't want to compromise the integrity of those branches and ruin stately old trees. Time happens, and so does decay. So we have this old barn, which we call our warehouse, which is all of our maintenance staff do their work. We have a lot of cool things they do, but part of the roof the tin had just literally rusted out. So we started replacing that tin with new stuff. So a lot of non-sexy things happen, y'all, in horticulture, and you need proper facilities to take care of everything you're doing. But when it's all said and done, there's the diamond. This is our beautiful garden, and we want you to come and see it. Love to have you, love to reconnect with all of y'all. And, I've enjoyed my year here. I miss those of y'all I've got to know in Tulsa, but I had a great time there and great time in Oklahoma. And you're always welcome down in the Gulf Coast. So from me and my lovely wife Heather, say hello and thank you for having me here. And hope you've enjoyed this talk. I've told Dr. Schnelly that if y'all wanted, you're welcome to submit submit questions via him or however to me, and then I will go ahead and answer them to get back to you. So thank you very much. Y'all have a great time, and take care and be safe. Bye-bye.
Well, I don't know about you guys. I really enjoyed Todd's talk today. And by the way, he's talking about talented significant others. His wife, Heather, is a landscape architect type person. So sometime we'll have to have his better half, or Heather Lasseigne, give us a lecture as well. Please guard September the 21st. We showed you that graphic at the beginning of the webinar on how genetic engineering works. It's free, but you've got to register for that, either through your smartphone on the QR code, through the link we provided. And then lastly, I remind you in the chat box as well, October the 14th, we will hear from Brian Pirtle, Colonial Gardens, Blue Springs, Missouri. You may remember Brian when he lived here in Oklahoma. He worked at TLC in Oklahoma City. That's where I first met him many, many years ago. And if you made any plant material conferences or watched their television show, Let's Talk Gardening, you know Brian. He's just gotten better and better with age, so I can't wait to get him back, at least virtually, here in a few weeks. I hope you'll all stay in touch. Again, as Todd mentioned, should you have any questions, throw them in the chat box, and we'll make sure Todd is able to address those at some point in time. We thank you again for your time. I thank all of my colleagues for their help to make this happen. Peter Harwell, Donna Dollins, many, many others as well. And on that note, I think we'll go ahead and shut down. And perhaps we'll see you or talk with you on September the 21st, the How Genetic Engineering Works webinar transpires. If not, we'll see or talk with you October the 14th, hearing Brian Pirtle from Blue Springs, Missouri. Thank you all. Have a great day. We'll talk again. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.